He looked at the other angels, and for the first time since they were created, he asked them to do something that could never be undone. Not to worship, not to obey, to rebel. These were not ordinary beings. They had stood in the presence of God. They had watched galaxies obey his command. They had witnessed a heaven untouched by death, untouched by sin, untouched by fear. They knew exactly who God was. And yet, one angel was asking them to abandon everything they had ever known. According to the book of Enoch, he said, "I fear that you alone will not agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of this great sin." He already knew it was a sin. He already knew judgment would come. He wasn't deceived. He wasn't confused. He simply didn't want to face the consequences alone. So he made them a promise. If we fall together. That angel's name was Shemyaza, the watcher whose decision, according to the book of Enoch, changed the course of the ancient world forever. Shemyaza was one of heaven's trusted watchers. According to the book of Enoch, the watchers were angels appointed to watch over the earth. They weren't created to rule humanity or to receive its praise. They were given a sacred responsibility to serve God's purpose and remain faithful to the place he had assigned them. Among them, Shemyaza stood as a leader. That alone tells us something important. Leaders are not chosen by accident. He had earned the trust of the angels around him. When he spoke, they listened. When he moved, they followed. There was a time when nothing separated him from the glory of heaven. He had seen the Creator's power. He had watched the stars move exactly as God commanded. He had never questioned God's authority, never imagined a world outside his will. Then, everything changed. The book of Enoch tells us the watchers looked upon the daughters of men. At first, it was only a glance, a curiosity, something easily dismissed. But temptation rarely announces itself as destruction. It disguises itself as fascination. Day after day, Shemyaza continued to watch humanity. He saw families grow. He saw people laugh, cry, love, build lives together. For the first time, something stirred inside him that had never existed before. Desire. It wasn't part of the purpose God had given him. Yet instead of turning away, he kept looking. Every day the line became easier to cross in his mind, until one thought refused to leave him. What if we went down, not to watch, to live among them? It was a thought he should have rejected the moment it appeared. Instead, he nurtured it. The desire grew until it became impossible to ignore. But Shemyaza understood something the others may not have fully grasped. This wasn't simply breaking a rule. It was abandoning heaven itself. He knew the cost. The words recorded in the book of Enoch prove it. Before anyone else agreed, before a single angel descended, before history changed forever, Shemyaza confessed what was already weighing on his heart. "I fear that you will not agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of this great sin." He didn't ask whether it was wrong. He already knew. He didn't wonder if God would forgive it. He already expected judgment. He didn't deceive the other watchers into believing there would be no consequences. He admitted the truth from the very beginning. This was sin, and if he acted alone, he would stand alone before God. That fear changed everything. Instead of walking away, instead of choosing obedience while he still could, Shemyaza searched for something else. Not forgiveness, agreement. If others joined him, the burden of the decision would no longer belong to him alone. It was a tragic way of thinking, because sharing guilt never removes it. But in that moment, fear spoke louder than wisdom. The leader heaven had trusted was about to ask the unthinkable, not because he doubted God, but because he chose his own desire over the God he already knew. And with a single decision, Shemyaza was about to lead heaven's watchers to a mountain where history would never be the same again. The decision had already been made in Shemyaza's heart. Now, he needed the others to make it with him. According to the book of Enoch, he gathered the watchers on the slopes of Mount Hermon. 199 angels stood before him, not strangers, not servants. They were his companions, angels who had stood beside him in the presence of God. For a moment, no one spoke. Shemyaza looked at the faces around him. He knew what he was about to ask would destroy everything they had ever known. Then he broke the silence, not with a command, with a confession. I fear that you will not agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of this great sin. Those words reveal something remarkable. Shemyaza wasn't driven by ignorance. He wasn't rebelling because he believed God was unjust. He wasn't questioning whether heaven's command was right. He already accepted that what he wanted was a great sin. His fear wasn't judgment. His fear was facing judgment, alone. So he made them an offer. If they were going to cross the line, they would cross it together. No one would turn back. No one would leave another to bear the punishment. Every one of them would swear an oath. The book of Enoch tells us they bound themselves together with a solemn curse. It wasn't a promise of loyalty to God. It was loyalty to one another. One by one, the watchers agreed, one by one. Voices that had once praised their Creator now pledged themselves to a path that could only end in judgment. Shemyaza watched each angel step forward. With every oath spoken, there was less chance of anyone turning back, until finally, the choice was complete. 200 watchers, one rebellion, one leader. The mountain where they stood would forever be remembered in the book of Enoch as Hermon, because there they swore and bound themselves by mutual oaths. It was more than a meeting. It was the funeral of their former lives. When they left that mountain, they would no longer be remembered as faithful watchers. They would become the fallen. Then came the descent. The book of Enoch tells us the watchers came down to the earth and took wives from among the daughters of men, just as they had planned. For Shemyaza, there was no triumph, only commitment. The moment his feet touched the earth, the way back to heaven was gone. There are decisions in life that can be undone, and there are decisions that divide your life into two parts, before and after. For Shemyaza, Mount Hermon was that dividing line. Everything he had been ended there. Everything he would become began there. He had gained what he thought he wanted, but he had already lost what mattered most, and he didn't yet realize. The world was about to pay the price for his decision. At first, nothing seemed different. The sun still rose. The river still flowed. People went about their lives, unaware that the greatest change in human history had already begun. Shemyaza had crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, and now, others were following his example. The book of Enoch says the watchers did exactly what they had sworn to do. They took wives from among the daughters of men. What began as a single act of rebellion quickly became something much larger. The watchers no longer lived as heaven had created them to live. They began sharing what had never been entrusted to humanity. The book of Enoch describes different watchers teaching different kinds of forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught the making of weapons and instruments of war. Others revealed enchantments, astrology, and hidden mysteries. Shemyaza wasn't remembered because he taught the most. He was remembered because he made it all possible. Without his decision, there would have been no oath. Without the oath, there would have been no descent. And without the descent, the corruption described in the book of Enoch would never have unfolded the way it did. As the years passed, Shemyaza watched the world change. Knowledge became power. Power became violence. People who had once depended on God began chasing control instead. The ancient text also tells of the Nephilim, the offspring associated with the union of the Watchers and human women. Their presence became part of the growing corruption that spread across the earth. Whether one reads these passages as literal history or as ancient tradition, the picture Enoch paints is unmistakable. The world was unraveling. This wasn't the future Shemyaza imagined. He had pursued desire. Instead, he had unleashed chaos. Everywhere he looked, the consequences were multiplying. Families lived in fear. Violence spread from one generation to the next. The earth groaned under the weight of human wickedness. Then came the words recorded in Genesis. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. Genesis places responsibility on humanity for its own choices. The book of Enoch adds another layer to the story, portraying the rebellion of the Watchers as part of the corruption that preceded the flood. Together they describe a world that had drifted far from God's design. Perhaps for the first time, Shemyaza understood what he had truly done. He hadn't challenged God's authority. He had wounded God's creation. The leader who believed he was gaining freedom had become the man whose choice echoed through every village, every family, every generation. And then, the silence ended. Heaven answered, not with another warning, with judgment. Shemyaza had spent years believing he could live with his decision. Then one day, heaven answered, not with thunder, not with debate, with a verdict. According to the book of Enoch, the cries of the earth rose before God. Violence had spread across the world. The corruption had reached its limit. The rebellion that began on Mount Hermon had become a tragedy no one could ignore. Then God spoke. The archangels were summoned. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel. Not to negotiate, to end the rebellion. For the first time since leaving heaven, Shemyaza was no longer the one making the decisions. He was the one being judged. The leader who had once stood before 200 watchers now stood before the justice of God. The book of Enoch says God commanded Michael to bind Shemyaza and the leaders of the watchers who had abandoned their place. There was no army to defend him. No follower stepped forward to take his place. The oath that had once united them could not save them. One by one, the watchers were seized. The rebellion that had seemed unstoppable ended without a battle, because no created being can overpower the one who created him. Imagine that final moment. Shemyaza looked at the angels surrounding him. These were not strangers. Some had stood beside him in heaven long before Mount Hermon. Now they had come to carry out God's judgment, not because they hated him, because they obeyed the one he had refused. According to the book of Enoch, the watchers were bound and kept for the day of final judgment. The leader who once walked freely in heaven now waited in chains. Then came the final blow. As judgment fell upon the watchers, the world they had changed also faced its own reckoning. Genesis tells us that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, while the rest of the earth had become filled with violence. The flood was coming. Everything Shemyaza had hoped to build would disappear beneath the waters. Every city, every ambition, every monument to human pride, gone. He had traded eternity for something that couldn't even survive a single generation of God's judgment. The mountain where he led 200 angels into rebellion was now only a memory. The voice that once persuaded heaven's watchers had fallen silent, for the first time since he uttered the words, "If we fall together." Shemyaza understood what they truly meant. They had fallen together, but each of them would answer to God, alone. The rebellion was over. The oath had been broken. The world Shemyaza helped change had vanished beneath the flood. Only one thing remained, his sentence. According to the book of Enoch, the watchers were kept in confinement, awaiting the day when God's final judgment would be carried out. No more mountains, no more followers, no more speeches, only time. Time to remember, time to reflect, time to face the weight of a single decision. It is striking that the book of Enoch never records another word from Shemyaza after his rebellion. The angel who persuaded 200 watchers to follow him falls silent. Perhaps that's the most haunting part of his story. He wasn't defeated because he lacked power. He wasn't destroyed because he lacked knowledge. He lost everything because he chose desire over obedience. He knew the cost before he took the first step. He said it himself. "I alone shall have to pay the penalty of this great sin." He recognized the penalty, yet he chose the path anyway. That is what makes his story so tragic. Not ignorance, choice. The New Testament preserves a similar warning. In Jude 6, we read, "And the angels who did not keep their own position of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day." Jude does not mention Shemyaza by name, but many scholars understand this passage as reflecting the same ancient tradition found in the book of Enoch. Peter echoes it as well. "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into gloomy darkness to be held for judgment." To 2 Peter 2:4. Whether you read the book of Enoch as history, ancient tradition, or theological literature, its message is difficult to ignore. Shemyaza had what every human being longs for. He lived in the presence of God, Yet he reached for something that was never his to take, and in pursuing one forbidden desire, he lost everything he already had. That is why his story has endured for centuries. Not because he became the greatest of the fallen, but because he reminds us that even extraordinary privilege does not replace faithful obedience. His name appears only briefly in the book of Enoch. Yet that brief mention became the beginning of one of the most influential stories in ancient Jewish tradition. The leader of the Watchers, the angel who gathered 200 companions on Mount Hermon, the one who asked them to swear an oath they could never take back. A single decision, a single mountain, a single leader. And according to the book of Enoch, the ancient world was never the same again. If you enjoyed this journey into one of the Bible's most fascinating ancient traditions, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Bible Mysteries, and tell us in the comments. Do you think Shemyaza's greatest sin was his desire or convincing others to follow him? Until next time, keep searching the scriptures.